Something here is calling us forward, upward motion. We're drops in one ocean. Roll on. Will you rise up with me today? Lift up your voice and boldly say, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Live the dream of your highest calling. Be the hope of a new day dawning. We're the ones who can make a difference. Let's stand together, sharing gifts with the world that's waiting for a change that we're all creating. It's a
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. We've all been scattering for summer vacations, and it's nice to see so many of you have made space for this broadcast tonight because we think it's really going to be a very compelling one. And in a minute, we'll go ahead and introduce you to our guest and our co-host, and Jim Kenney, who has been my co-host throughout this process of New Thought on the News. So I think maybe we have a lot to discuss tonight. It's a very compelling subject, and I would like my co-host, Stephen Pope, to go ahead and introduce our special guest this evening. So could you please go ahead and introduce Steve?
Testing, 1, 2, 3, there we go. Well, I feel honored to introduce Steve Behrman, who's our guest this evening. He's a writer, author, and just as a side thing, a humorist, who's spent 30 years writing and performing in the guise of the cosmic comic Swami Beyondananda. He's an astute political and cultural commentator and a pioneer in alternative education and holistic publications. His latest book with cellular biologist Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's the author of The Biology of Belief, is called A Spontaneous Evolution, Our Positive Future and a Way to Get There from Here. Noted author Marianne Williamson has called Steve, or Swami Beyondananda, the Mark Twain of our times, which I'm looking forward to seeing in evidence tonight.
Thanks for being with us tonight, Steve.
Well, thank you for having me. And as for Mark Twain, I think we're on two similar tracks, but not exactly.
Uh-oh. This is going to be a dangerous evening. Okay.
He started with the punishment already.
I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce Jim Kenney before we play our opening video for tonight. For those of you who have not met Jim, because we are here for the first time, he is the co-founder and executive director of Common Ground, an adult educational organization and study center headquartered in Chicago. He is author of Thriving in the Crosscurrent, Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change. He is also founding trustee of the International Committee for the Peace Council and project coordinator, bringing together influential religious and spiritual leaders to serve world peace. Jim is co-editor of the Interreligious Insight Journal and former founding trustee and global director of a Council for Parliament of the World's Religions. Hi, Jim. Hi, Jim. You were muted, sorry.
I'm sorry. Hi, Barbara, and hi, Steve, and hi, everyone.
Great. So sometimes when we have an AGNT leader who is leading the discussion with us, we start with an opening blessing or invocation. And since do we have ordained clergy here? Stephen Pope maybe, but we're gonna take a different approach, because since we're talking tonight about who do we want to be in the United States of America, and how do we get our love and our pride and our energy back for this nation, I thought that we would start out with a very inspiring video. That's a music video, and it was created by a New Thought musician, Daniel Maymott, and a rapper friend of his called Nemo Patel. So we're going to take a look at that because it'll get us in the right mood. Here we go. Oops, I guess I have to share my screen with you before I can do any of this. Here we go. And Stephen, if you would mute yourself.
It's burning inside, the hurting and the suffering minds, creating anger, fear and pain, suffocating our times. The tougher it gets, the rougher social media cries. But we see to it that we tweeting only negative lines. We're sick and tired of history, but repeating it twice. Greed, anger and violence, clearly stealing our nights. Feeling it tight between the shoulders with a chill in the spine. Pinching myself, waking up, trying to stop the rewind and move forward towards stories, overcoming our fears. Choosing love over hate, praying, trading hugs over tears. There's only one choice, breaking down the walls and repair every broken heart on this planet till there's no longer fear.
Walls can't hold us in. Fear can't keep us down. Love will rise again. Yeah, it's rising right now. We shall overcome.
Every time I think it's gonna take much longer,
We shall overcome.
every time I question, am I getting stronger?
We have just begun.
Gonna make a change, we gotta push much farther.
We shall overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Young Gandhi couldn't fathom how to deal with himself when he was thrown off the train and the pain that he felt. Mrs. Parks disrespected, dragged into jail because of the color of his skin, organs, tissues, and cells. One day, a young girl was shot on a bus by a man, a terrorist, part of the Taliban. He said, "On this land, you have no right to stand for what you believe in. Girls have no chance here." Well, now, that's just the story of three souls who shook our planet after being down on their knees. And it's not gonna stop. Those seeds have now become trees, and as human beings, we'll keep on digging till we find peace.
Yeah, the cynics always say that nothing ever changes. The human nature's bound to stay the same. But it couldn't be more plain that violence never pays, injustice never stays. It's bound to fade away. What if history awaits? What if today's the day? We already know the way, so let's all lead the way. We shall overcome.
Every time I think it's gonna take much longer,
We shall overcome.
every time I question, am I getting stronger?
We have just begun.
Gonna make a change, we gotta push much farther.
We shall overcome.
We shall overcome. Come on now. Every time I think it's gonna take much longer,
We shall overcome.
every time I question, am I getting stronger?
We shall overcome someday.
'Cause I'm feeling it deep in my heart.
Deep in my heart.
together. Here we go. Woo! I knew it. God had a plan for us to do it. To hit rock bottom before we rise and continue. To first learn greed before we learn to be human. To do wrong deeds before we learn to spread beauty. There's always a plan, and now it's time to take a stand for the right of the planet, every woman and man. We ain't gonna stop, only growing our demands for all beings to feel peace in every heart and land. Thank you, Lord, for the strength and the courage to bring us together and keep our souls nourished. These tough times will only drown in our chorus, cause we all believe that the truth is before us. We shall overcome this pain. We shall overcome this day. We pray for love to lead the way. We pray for love to lead the way.
So that I find to be a very inspiring way to start this evening. Obviously, it's not so easy, and what we're going to look at tonight, and we'll discuss our topics in a minute, and then get right into the conversation. But I wanted to remind those, especially those who are new to the call, that the salon is based on the foundations for this series, which is a 4-part tutorial that is based on Jim's book. And in it, he presents a model of cultural sea change. So if you haven't already checked it out, I will send the URL for people to go to, and you'll be able to see that although that kind of inspiration can't happen overnight, we do have it within our power to overcome. So I'm going to ask Stephen if he would go ahead and summarize the topics we're discussing this evening.
Unmute.
Looks like the lovely list of topics that are very apropos. And the top level question is just, who do we want to be in the world? So it's got subtopics such as localism versus nationalism versus globalism. I would insert there the word tribalism. The question of what does it mean to be a citizen at these different levels in our communities of our nation? What does it mean to be a global citizen? Another topic might be why Americans must converse about the higher sense of purpose. A question of, can we take back the meaning of our words, concepts, and integrity? Very important question. Are we in a hierarchical model or an interdependent one? Or in what parts of our lives and activity are we in these different models? And lastly, how do we make this shift practical?
Great, thank you. So let's dive right in. And I'm going to ask you, Steve, to open with some remarks on the topic that you are studying in depth in your life right now. And the question is, what does your topic, spontaneous evolution, have to do with current events? And what positive contribution can this perspective make? So why don't you go ahead and take it?
Thanks, Barbara. First of all, spontaneous evolution actually offers what I would call a meta-story. In other words, it offers a bigger picture to contextualize what we're going through right now. If we look at just the details, it certainly looks like things are falling apart and we're heading for a dystopian future. However, spontaneous evolution offers us a different idea about where we're going. Bruce Lipton, my co-author, cellular biologist, says that the next phase of human evolution, should we choose it, is recognizing that we're each and all cells in a larger superorganism called humanity. So why does this make a difference? Well, those of us who are really looking at what's really going on, the multiplicity of crises that seem to be all coming together at the same time. There's There's economic crisis, there's climate change, environmental crisis, political crisis, perhaps a psycho-spiritual crisis as well. And Bruce would say that crisis precipitates evolution, and we'd recognize that the chances of precipitation are about 100%. So what we're looking at is a very challenging time. And perhaps people, in fact, even some of the people I know who are scientists who've been studying climate change, they're actually in a sense of despair about what's really going on. And so perhaps what is needed is a miracle. Well, you know, there actually is a template for miracles. And the template for miracles is called spontaneous remission. And perhaps we know people in our lives who have been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, fatal perhaps, and they've been told that there's nothing more that medicine can do. And so they go home, and then by some magic, they recover. They get completely well. The disease disappears. And so a doctor, Dr. Louis Mael Madrona, wrote a book called Coyote Medicine, where he studied the stories of many of these people who had these spontaneous healings. And he found that the one common theme was they had what he called a change of story, a change of story. So something in what they were telling themselves, something in the life they were living, something in their career or relationship or location or belief system had caused this disease condition. And simply, maybe not so simply, by changing that story, by making a change, by setting out in a different direction, the disease no longer needed to exist. They had a spontaneous remission. And so in our societal ills that we're facing right now, perhaps what we need is a spontaneous remissioning, where we change our mission from the subconscious mission that our species has had for millennia, which is it's me or you, dominate or be dominated. And to change that to we're all in this together, we're all cells in the same organism. A shift of context is really what's required so that the actual content of life changes.
Lovely.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for those opening remarks. I can't wait to invite Jim to jump right into the conversation on this big topic tonight of who we want to be in the world and how are we going to get there. So I'm going to ask you to just begin by summarizing the main concept in your model, which would support the discussion, and then go right ahead and tell us what you're thinking about.
Hi, and I loved what Steve just had to say. It really works for me perfectly well. Normally in these conversations, I've spent about 3 minutes summarizing the idea in my book, which is simply the idea that cultural evolution is real, that it happens, that it's happening now, that happens to be a very, very controversial idea. But the question is this: do cultures evolve? Does human culture evolve, or does it merely change? And I'm a very strong proponent of the idea that it does evolve. By cultural evolution, I simply mean that our dominant values, our culture's most influential values, move slowly in the direction of a closer fit with reality. So gradually it dawns on us that slavery was always wrong. Patriarchy was always based on mistaken assumptions about the genders. Our idea that the planet is fragile, is not fragile, excuse me, the idea that the planet is not fragile, wrong. And the idea that it's never going to be possible to do anything meaningful about social and economic justice and universal human rights, that also turns out to be wrong. So gradually, our dominant values catch up with our constantly changing, constantly evolving reality. The only other thing, normally I spend a little longer, but the only other thing I want to add right now is that the model I set forth in this book is a model of punctuated cultural evolution, which is to say that every now and then, and in the book I argue that it's happened 4 times, and we're in the most recent of those times, every now and then the whole process of cultural evolutionary change is dramatically accelerated. I believe that all those values I talked about, from peace to justice, to gender equity, to ecological commitment, and so on, ecological health, all of those are interlinked and interlocking. And every now and then the evolutionary process is dramatically accelerated. And even though it doesn't feel like it, we're in one of those times right now. So I believe that the idea of spontaneous remission, and I love the remissioning, revisioning, remissioning that Steve talks about, is eminently possible. So we also start with these things. We start with a story in the news, something in the news that's worth talking about, or at least worth being aware of. And the biggest story in the news these past troubled weeks and even months has been the whole idea of America First, that whole very ugly new meme, America First. It's not so new, but it's present in with a new ferocity and, as I say, a new ugliness. America First. It's resurgent nationalism. It's retro in every imaginable way. It's increasingly, that attitude is increasingly cutting us off politically from other peoples, other nations, from those who should be our allies, or with whom at least we ought to be involved, say, in a serious conversation about what to do about our planetary climate. And we're losing all those connections. So what does it mean if that's the big story? And how does that fit against the backdrop of a cultural evolutionary arc? And so I haven't used this language before in these settings, but I would like to talk just a little bit about cultural evolution as an arc of ascending values. And we can look for that in a social context. We can see it in a political context. We can watch for it in an economic context. We can absolutely see it in a religious and spiritual context. No question about that. An arc of ascending values as our dominant values move away from their inertial sort of darkness into a new and powerfully momentum-driven new, let's say it's not so new, but a new ascension. So I think something that Steve said offers the perfect counter intuition or counter idea to the idea of America First or nationalism, this resurgent nationalism, ugly nationalism. We are all populist nationalists. We're in it for ourselves. We don't define ourselves any longer, at least those that heed this. What's the opposite of a clarion call? It's the siren call from the dark side. Those that heed that have given up all attempts to define themselves in terms of their own virtues. Instead, they're defining themselves in terms of what they perceive to be the vices of others. So we end up saying, thank God I'm not a fill in the blank. Thank God I'm not a woman, a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim. Thank God I'm not a liberal. Thank God I'm not an ecologist. Thank God I'm not a person of color. Thank God I'm not from the South or the North. You know what I'm getting at. So what's the opposite model or motif? And Steve said it tonight. We're all in this together. There's no better way to say it. What's the antidote to ugly nationalism? It is not the taking up the banner of being in this together, but simply remembering that we are all in this together. So something that you did, Barbara, when we were having our first very sketchy chat about all this, you wrote down, and Stephen Pope just read this back to us, who do we want to be in the world? You said there are three sort of orientations that we ought to take into consideration. One is localism, one is nationalism, One is if you will, globalism, or we can think in a local way, we can think in a national way, we can think in a global way. I'd like to apply that idea of an arc of ascending values to those three, and to say that thinking locally becomes richer, deeper, more informed when I recognize that my village is part of a larger world, a larger, we might use the term national, a nation, an ethos, an ethnic group, and an ethos as well. That's going to deepen, broaden, and I think enrich my local perspective. We used to toss around the phrase, think globally, act locally. And I think that's appropriate at each of these stages. So for a moment, just try on for size. Think nationally, act locally. That makes very good sense. And then as we move to a more national perspective, let me just go back and say, we all understand how a purely local perspective can be very limiting. If my perspective is local, period, then the first stranger that comes up over the hill is going to be perceived as an enemy. I have no other context in which to place her or in which to place him. But once I'm aware of a larger enfolding reality that we're using the shorthand nation to describe or to indicate, then I'm open to the idea that the stranger that comes over the hill is potentially a new neighbor and ultimately perhaps a new friend. So that movement from stranger to neighbor to friend is a movement that only becomes possible as my perspective broadens. But the big broadening, the most exciting, it seems to me, climb of the arc is from a national perspective to a global. And we have all that it takes these days. We're surrounded by all the information, all the data, and so on, to give us national perspective. If you think about it this way, everyone listening here, and everyone that all of us online, and all of us who are part of this conversation have interacted with today or this year, take that huge group that I'm indicating there, and all of us together, as a group, we know more about other cultures, other peoples, other religions, other language, the planetary geography than anyone has ever known. And so we have this kind of built-in kit for global perspective, and yet here we are being charmed, being enticed, blandished into a narrowing of that perspective. You know, you're deep down, you know you're potentially a global citizen, and here comes the call of the Pied Piper who's saying, no, come back home, come back to a smaller vision, a smaller home, come back within borders that are defined not by what you understand but by what you hate, not by what you love but by what you fear. So it's an ugly diminishment. So we have the option of saying, no, I don't want to do that. I want to follow that arc of possibility, and I want to embrace and find out more about what it would mean to be finally a global citizen. I have been intrigued with and charmed by that idea since, and I'm almost finished here, but since a conference that I was involved in organizing in Chicago in 2009. It was part of a series of conferences that the series is ongoing. It's called Globalization for the Common Good, and it brings together activists and economists and spiritual leaders and people that think it's possible it's possible to come together in some kind of global way that leaves aside neoliberal exploitation and leaves aside a big power monopolization and leaves aside corporate foolishness. Anyway, it's a great series of conferences, and I organized one in Chicago. And one of the things we were able to put together, thanks to the help of a good friend who works with young people who are looking for kind of alternative collegiate and post-collegiate experiences, was to bring kids together. Kids, I say kids from, let's say, 19 to 25, 26, 27, 28, all of whom are having experiences in global education. They're all part of new university or trans university projects that help young people move into the idea of global citizenship. So they're learning languages, they're traveling, they're studying in different places. And I was so blown away by conversations with these young people, each one of whom absolutely understood intuitively, instinctively, and at a deep heart level what it meant to be a global citizen. And they were able to explain that to people who had never, ever heard the term, people much older, and people who were certainly open to the idea, but who had never thought about it, and speaking from their heart and speaking from a place where it's no longer an intellectual exercise for them. It's just something they know. They're global citizens. Are they patriotic? Sure. I mean, do they love their respective countries? They come from different countries. Yes, they do. But they would all say, I can't love my country unless I first love my world. Unless I'm a global citizen, I can't be a citizen of the UK or the US or France or Brazil or whatever it happens to be. That was a life-changing experience for me. And so the term global citizen has never been far from my mind or my lips since then. And I think that's the antidote. We're all in this together. We're all global citizens. And to be a committed local citizen, lovely. To be a committed citizen of a nation or an ethos, lovelier still. But to be a global citizen, there you go. That's what we're trying to accomplish.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to ask for Steve's remarks and comments on that in just a minute. But this idea of we're all in it together, that's a reality. And the reality is we're in it together for better or for worse. And I was on a call earlier today and about the Parliament of Religions. And one of the women who is on our task force in Toronto made the note that was talking about the gun violence that had happened there recently and the instance of increased gun violence that was uncharacteristic of their city and of their nation. And I thought, remember Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic field? Are we infecting in some transcendent manner nations that are not characteristically hierarchical and violent? Is that somehow leaking out into Canada? And it was a shocking realization at the moment. But Steve, I'm going to ask you to make some comments now.
Unmute myself? Okay, good. First of all, I want to acknowledge Jim for wrestling away the term globalism and globalization from those who associate it only with neoliberalism. I think that there is a global view that's much more resonant with Bucky Fuller's idea of Spaceship Earth. I think it's time to revive that metaphor as well. We're all passengers and hopefully crew. I think one of the puzzling things is, we do have all of these tremendous resources. We have resources in love. We have resources in the ability to do work, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, why have we not yet been able to turn this into a, let's call it a predominant governing meme for the planet? And we've been living for thousands of years under the rule of what I would call the lowest common dominator, that it's been dominate or be dominated. That's been the way things have been. And so subconsciously, I think many of us, even the most quote-unquote enlightened among us, tend to default toward that survival mechanism. There was a study done by some folks at Yale last fall. And I'll give you a very, very broad idea of what they came to, but basically, when we feel more relaxed and safe, we become more progressive or liberal. When we feel more threatened by fear, we become more conservative. And they've shown that when you change the atmosphere and mood in a room, people will actually change their perspective on issues. So I want to offer that as something that there are the emotional and spiritual reasons why we haven't yet been able to realize this ideal. The other thing is after the election, Otto Scharmer, who is a political theorist who has something called Theory U, said that when a civilization is in decline, and I guess he was referring to ours, there's three tendencies, three ways of dealing with it. One is you go backward and build a wall. The other one is you go forward together and build something new. Or number three, you default to the status quo. And each of the three presidential candidates in 2016 represented one of those. Of course, Donald Trump represents building a wall and going backward. Again, when people are in fear about what's happening, that's what the default is. Those who followed Bernie, that was much more of a let's build something forward by cooperating together and building community. And Hillary represented the status quo. And the general mood of the country was so counter to status quo that they actually chose Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. So I think that it's important to recognize that we can't go backward to a status quo from here. That's one of the, evolution only works in one direction. So right now, the good news is the platform that the shaky platform we had been on has been taken away from us. And now our choice is to build a new platform and to build a compelling meme that's so much stronger than the Donald Trump meme. Rather than resisting Trump, it's moving forward together around an idea whose time has come.
Thanks, Steve. The president of AT&T, Michael Beckwith, has a statement that many have heard before, which is, when we're at a juncture like this, we can either be pushed by our pain or pulled by a vision. And I think that what you're getting at here is that this is exactly true in the Democratic Party when we talk about why can't they create a compelling narrative, even though we don't like what the Republican Party has to share with us. They're very, very good in making a coherent message for the society. So I guess that what I'm thinking about here is that we have to somehow take the narrative back and frame it in a more positive light. And that was one of the things we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to ask Jim if he would like to take a stab at that one.
Take a stab at how the Democratic Party reframes a meme.
No. This idea of how do we take back the narrative? How do we take back our words?
Yeah, let me say this, that I want to represent just a slightly different voice and outlook here. I suppose it's because ever since I got to work researching and writing this Thriving in the Crosscurrent book and talking about evolutionary sea change. By the way, we've thrown around that term sea change. It's just my term for these occasional periods of dramatic acceleration of the process of cultural evolution. I think it goes along all the time, but every now and then there's a real jump, and it involves all of our interdependent co-evolutionary values. So because I've been so obsessed with that and thinking about it and so on, I am less a collector of gloom and doom narratives and much more a collector of positive narratives, things that point to how dramatically things are in fact changing. Now, I can't do that work without being fully briefed on the gloom and doom. So don't think I need a seminar on gloomishness. I know about it, and I do a lot of lecturing on modern politics, and I end up talking about the current administration much more often than I would normally care to. But I think we live in one of the most interesting and exciting times ever. And the reason for that is that things are changing. People are thinking more positively and more creatively. And Barbara, you know this because you've done with the Gandhi King Foundation, you've done these projects bringing people together saying, okay, what are you doing this year? What's your new project to get people thinking about peace and nonviolent conflict resolution, or social and economic justice and universal human rights, or ecological sanity, and treating the planet as our fragile home, and so on. I think in all of those ways, people are thinking much more broadly and much more creatively than they used to. One of the things I throw out often in lectures is that, 75%, now don't laugh when you hear this, 75% of Americans think they're environmentalists. Now, on the face of it, that's completely goofy. It's not true. But wouldn't you prefer that 75% think they're environmentalists or are thinking in that way, wondering what that would be like, than if it were 10? So I think that's hopeful. But my real hope is grounded in the next generation that is thinking absolutely in much more creative ways. Now, I don't mean every youngin is thinking that way, but I mean there's tremendous hope, not just in the United States, but around the world, in the next generation of people who do believe that social and economic justice and universal human rights are possible, that the earth can be nurtured and partnered with. We're not going to be able to undo what we have done to the planetary climate, but we can slow it down a little bit, and we can make a difference. We can start to make a difference tomorrow. And I think, yeah, you're right, Steve, that we haven't gotten to a point where we have a governmental system that reflects these values. But my view is that this is a bottom-up, not a top-down sort of thing. And first, what happens is, and then I'll shut up, our values change, then gradually our behavior changes, and then and only then our slow, lumbering institutions come along. So when I hear someone say, well, I've checked with the Vatican, there doesn't seem to be much happening there, or I've looked at Washington and I don't see the change you're talking about, you're looking in the wrong place, right? Look on your block, look to the people you know best, explore what's happening among organizations that work with youth in Africa or Latin America or the East, and so on. And there's not reason to forget our worries, but there's reason to rediscover our hope and our energy. There's abundant reason for that. This is a good time to get plugged in. By the way, Steven Pinker, who's an evolutionary psychologist that I'm sure some of you know, who wrote a remarkable book, I think, called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And he begins by saying, the 20th century was the least violent century in human prehistory and history that we can measure. And he knows, as he speaks to his audiences, that everybody in the audience knows that's not true. But it is true. And by the end of his presentation, he's persuaded us. He has a new book that everyone should take a look at. I think I recommended it last time. It's called Enlightenment Now: Reason, Science, and Humanism. And he said, if you could pick a period in Earth's prehistory and history to be reborn, you'd be crazy not to pick now.
Yeah, this almost always brings us back to a point in the discussion where we're thinking about the way that en masse we're receiving our messages and the media itself in that entire discussion, because regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, the progressive media and the conservative media are overwhelmingly focusing on a bad story that's driving everyone crazy and inciting anger and dissonance and so on. So that's another big piece, is how do we communicate to each other the good news, which is certainly out there, as you point out. So I'm going to ask Steve to make some comments and then maybe take some questions or comments from our attendees.
Well, you know, again, under the radar, there are new institutions that are being born. And my colleague, Richard Lang, who's the author of Virtual Country, the originator of the National Town Square, Richard calls this a ecosystem for citizen engagement. And this includes projects like Living Room Conversations, which bring people together from different sides to rehumanize after they've been dehumanized by one side or another. And these are very, very promising, because what happens in these conversations is that people are pulled away from the most divisive and polarizing narratives that are currently used by our two political parties as a way of preserving themselves, these wedge issues. And they begin to recognize that maybe we can find solutions together. The National Town Square idea is a totally independent, independent of media, government, corporations, institution where every individual in this country would have a verifiable and authenticated voice and vote. They would be able to vote on various issues, and the authentication would be at the level of bank cards. So no bots, no, and also no selling of information, and so on. So imagine what would happen if 50 million people or 100 million people all said at the same time, we want this. Then we would have a very strong advisory branch of the government that we don't have right now. And it certainly seems that the government as it is can't really reform itself. There was a very interesting conference I went to called Represent Us, Unrig the System. And I was very heartened to find people from all across the political spectrum who recognize that the power of money has distorted our national priorities and our national conversation. So I just want people to know that these things are out there, they're being built, they're being funded, and just as surely as the imaginal cells of the butterfly ultimately replace the caterpillar cells, these imaginal cells are being built and created.
Yeah, definitely. Stephen Pope, do you have any comments at this point? You've been I'm thinking you might, so would you like to share that with us? Then we might open up to some questions.
Yes, I just had two quick comments. One was getting back to this idea of the mood you're in determines how you respond to things. I grew up in New York, and the joke used to be a Republican is a Democrat who's been mugged, and a Democrat is a Republican who's been arrested. And I think the problem right now, or the challenge, I won't say the problem, the challenge is the media are telling us to be afraid. The media are telling us there's a huge injustice. Nothing new is going on here. We've been here before. We've had times in our nation that were very, very challenging. We've had demagogues before. We've had criminal presidents before. So I think the whole thing is just to look back, take a deep breath, which is my new thing, which is count to 3, take a deep breath, and realize we can do this. We just have to not be distracted by the distractor in chief. And it's, for so many liberals I'm in contact with, they realize, elect a clown, expect the circus is the joke, but we're being distracted from what's actually going on. And people of faith and people who are progressive socially have to just say, let's focus on the work at hand. Let's not focus on posting things to Facebook, cussing at people. That's really not productive.
Yep, amen to that. I'm going to ask, we've got attendees here with us live tonight. You all know that you can raise your hand and ask a question or enter the discussion. Is there anybody who would care to make a comment at this point before we wrap up? Yeah, here's Jim Taylor, one of our regulars. So Jim, I'm going to put you on the screen here for a second. Hi, go ahead.
Just a quick comment. Deeply affected by Jim's book. And in the conversations that I'm in at least one of the interfaith groups I'm in, the emphasis is on social justice. And in that environment, the level of fear and revulsion and all those sorts of emotions is very high. And I think I've mentioned it before, but there is such a powerful tool in Jim's metaphor of the eddy. Every time I share this metaphor with someone, this understanding, if you look from a high view down at the river moves. There's no way of stopping the movement of the river. But those little eddies can be very frightening when you're caught in them or even approaching them. So thank you for that, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. We're getting pretty close to wrapping up, and I wonder, Jim Kenny, if you've had some thoughts as we've been discussing this.
I think you said this to us before, and I really appreciate it. For those that are hearing it for the first time, the eddy is just the idea that as older shop-worn values decline in influence in our lives, so there's a wave passing out, and here comes a new wave of newer values. At some point, the older values on the way out and the newer values on the way in are roughly equal in influence. They're crossing like that. What's it like to be at the time when the old values and the new values are equal in influence? It's exactly like living right now. That's what we're suffering from. And that produces turbulence. And since I've got this watery metaphor with waves going various ways, I looked for a term and I came up with eddy. And an eddy is a counterclockwise whirlpool that tries for all it's worth to resist and reverse the flow of a stream. No eddy ever did that. But you sure don't want to be caught in one because it can ruin your day or sink your boat. So most of the things, when we throw up our hands and say the whole thing is going to hell, chances are we're stuck in or have just been buffeted by an eddy. And the flow of the stream, what we might call politically the progressive flow of the stream, but the new value flow of the stream is still there, and we can count on that. Evolution, and I think that Steve, I think all of us would agree, evolution doesn't stop. You can't say, okay, enough of this, we're going to stop it by digging in our heels. It doesn't stop, and the eddy is just a momentary illusion that might trick you into thinking it stopped. Spins you around, messes up your day, but you can still keep going. Eddy always leaves you going in the right direction, by the way.
Oh, that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought of before. So to you, Steve Behrman, one of the points that we wanted to cover tonight had to do with what are some of the practical ways that we can actually become participants in this shift, which I think we all agree unilaterally is absolutely possible. It's not only possible, it's almost inevitable. That's how I feel. That's where my sense of spirituality and faith actually lives, is that there are things that I can't know with my mind. They don't make sense by reading the news. They don't really register as true in terms of my analytical thought process. And yet it can't crush my deep-seated conviction that we have to come through this better than ever, any more than the extremely depressing political narrative as of late has been able to crush my inherent patriotism. So, Steve Behrman, why don't you take a stab at this one?
Take a stab. I don't know if I want to take a stab, but I'll offer some ideas. I think, first of all, we have to rehearten ourselves and one another. This is where the local aspect really works, because if you're online all the time and you're getting all of this feedback, your intake of the news, you need to, I would suggest mental floss once a day, at least doing this once a day. 4 out of 5 transcendentists recommend mental floss to prevent truth decay, okay? So what we need to do is we need to clear ourselves of all of the input that's coming from other people and other ideas. The second thing is community and connection. One of the things that moves evolution forward, it's been true in every stage of evolution, from biological to cultural evolution. Every phase of evolution involves two things: increased connection and community, and increased awareness. So, as Jim pointed out earlier, there is tremendous amount of awareness on the planet, tremendous amount of knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And now there is that wisdom. There's the wisdom to contextualize the knowledge. And I would say that if we had to boil that wisdom down, I would boil it down to the golden rule, to recognizing that we're so connected that what we do to another, we do to ourselves. And then from the golden rule, I would take it even further and take it to the ultimate, the Buddhist blessing, may all beings be happy. May all beings be happy leaves nobody out, leaves nothing out. There are no exceptions. Like the sun shining on everyone, even the villains, even the what Caroline Casey calls the dementors of doom. Even those people, the sun is shining on them as well. So as part of our journey right now, it's to recognize the contrast and to ask ourselves, and what would we like instead? Because it's through telling that vision that we're actually going to create a movement of movements to turn the funk into function and leave the junk at the junction.
I knew I could count on you for that message. It's delightful and true. Jim, do you have any closing remarks before we end up here?
Actually, the only thing I can think of is Steve obviously knows Caroline Casey, and would you give her my love?
I will. I was on her show earlier today, so
she's terrific.
Yeah.
And thank you all. I thought tonight was really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you
That's
too.
all I got.
No, you've given us so much, and I'm very grateful to both of you. Steve Behrman, any other closing comments? What did you really want to say and you forgot?
Oh, well, I wanted to reiterate that, well, actually, my radio show is Wiki Politiki, and I'm sure that Jim Kenney will be a guest on there very soon. This is where we really air some of the most leading edge ideas to bring people together. And I think that's what's really important, to keep our conversations much more toward that future that we know is inevitable.
Oh, thank you. So thanks to all of you who attended tonight, and I hope you gained as much as we did from the discussion. I'll be sending out tomorrow links to where you can review this recording at your leisure. If you'd like to listen to it again or share it with others, please. Thank you, Jim Kenney. Thank you, Steve Behrman. Thank you to my co-host, Stephen Pope. And remember that next month in August, New Thought on the News will be on vacation. You should get some time off, right? But we're coming back on Thursday, September 20th with Jim Kenney and AGNT President Michael Bernard Beckwith, who many of you know, which promises to be as dynamic as this session, and we'll keep you posted. So have a lovely August. Thanks for attending, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.